Hi, this is Eric Keller for ZBrush Jewelry Workshop. In this video, we're going to finish working on our Dumbo Octopus ring. And the main goals is to actually model the ring part of it and create a mount for the octopus itself and make sure that the tentacles don't become finger shredders, because some of these details right here, while they look really nice, they could actually, slice up somebody's hand, and that's the last thing we want to do for our jewelry, right? So we're going to start by working with this ring geometry a little bit. It's a little bit on the thick side. I'm going to get it prepared so that we can actually have the octopus sitting on top of it properly. So the first thing I'm going to do is scale the interior of the ring so it's not quite so thick. So let's select that ring subtool. I'm going to turn on polyframe just so we can see how this is built. So it's an extremely simple geometry. It just has, one row of polygons in the middle, one row of polygons on the edges, and then a row of polygons on the outside. So I'm going to press W to pull up the gizmo, and let's center it. And I'm going to click on this button to switch over to transpose. So we can use the transpose as a measuring tool. So I'm going to click on this vertice right here and drag this out. And then let's zoom in here. Let's choose a darker color so it's easier to see. There we go. So if we go into preferences, remember we can set the units to millimeters. So I'll just type in mm, hit enter, that's millimeters. And I want to set my minor ticks to 2 and my major ticks to 1 so that we know that this is 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters. I'm going to click on this circle right here, which just sets the pivot point over here. And I'm going to pull this in to about the 2 millimeter mark. So now we have a good visual guide as to what 2 millimeters of thickness looked like. So what I want to do is I want to mask just these interior vertices here so that I can scale this out and reduce the thickness. So I'm going to hold the control key and open up the brush palette, and I'm going to choose mask perfect circle and hold control, drag my mask so it just encompasses those inside vertices. Then before I let go, I'm going to hold the Alt key. That reverses the masking, and when I let go, the inside polygons are not masked and everything else is masked. So zoom in here and go down to my deformations palette. I'm going to turn off Z so it's just going to be doing X and Y, and then I'm going to scale up until it matches that tick mark. Remember, you can also select this and type in a value. So if I type in 0.1, let's do 0.5. There we go. That looks pretty good. And press F to zoom out. So you can see that's our new sized ring. So I'm going to hold control, drag, and release to clear the mask. Let's switch back to draw, and then I'm going to hit Control D a few times just to subdivide the ring mesh. So next I'm going to switch back to the octopus subtool. And what I want to do is I want to pull these tentacles and the parts of the octopus up and away from the finger that's going to be wearing the ring. Because these suction cups will act as like little saw blades, and that's not very comfortable. We're also going to be building a platform from the ring geometry to kind of help support the octopus and also protect the finger, and also allow us to add some more decorative elements like maybe some coral or something like that. So because of the way I set up the subtools here, I have some choices. So right now this is the Dynameshed version of the model, but we also have our original subdivided version plus the webbing here, which is a separate subtool. So we could continue to pose this Dynameshed version, but the pulling and pushing and the smoothing is going to distort all the details that we sculpted in here. So we'll have to go back and fix that, which is not necessarily ideal. If we use the subdivided version, this one right here, I'll press the solo button so we can just see that. What I can do is I can press Shift D to go down to the lowest level of subdivision, down here, move this around, and that will reduce the amount of distortion and stretching that we have to deal with the suction cups and all the other details that we sculpted in here. So that's probably a better way to go. We still have this as separate geometry, and we can keep that as separate geometry. This is just the webbing that goes between the tentacles. So we could keep that as separate and then just make adjustments as necessary. So I might do that. That feels like less work than for me, because then we can, of course, go back and re-dynamesh the whole model together along with the ring geometry and set it up to be decimated so that we can export for print. So let's go down here to this dynameshed version, and I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to go to this version. Let's turn off the solo button and make sure we're at the lowest subdivision level. So Shift D to all the way to the lowest subdivision level. I'm going to hide the webbing for the moment. And now we can start repositioning these tentacles away from the finger. Okay, so I sped up the video about 3 times, just because this is a lot of nudging and squishing and squashing, and that's not necessarily compelling video to watch in real time anyways. So I've lowered the Z intensity on the move topological brush so that it's nice and gentle as I push things around. I also lowered the Z intensity on the smooth brush, and you can do that by holding the Shift key and lowering the Z intensity, so that'll just affect the smooth brush. And I'm also thinking while I'm working about, later on, I'm going to have to fill in some of the spaces like underneath the fins with some geometry so that it's a bit more economical and efficient to print, but I'm going to do that later. The other thing we want to keep in mind is this is going to sit between fingers, so we don't want any geometry necessarily going over the side too much, especially we don't want it going down. I like to use the wireframe and make it visible whenever possible because it helps me visualize keeping the geometry nice and even, so I can reduce the amount of stretching or correct some of the stretching. Okay, so let's go to the highest subdivision level on the octopus. So I'm going to switch over to the ring subtool. So it's about 65,000 points. I'm going to delete lower levels of subdivision and switch on Sculptress mode. So let's switch to Snake Hook, turn on Sculptress, and this will allow us to pull out some geometry. So our octopus has something to sit on. And I'm going to press X to turn on symmetry, so you can see the 2 red dots there indicating we have symmetry on. And now I can start to pull this out. So as I demonstrated in a previous video in this series, the way Sculptress mode works is that while it's on, while that yellow Sculptress button is on, every time I pull on the geometry, it's going to add points to the surface. It's going to tessellate it. So you can see the edges are kind of crinkly there because of that. And if you look at the active points tally up on the top, you'll see that it goes up each time I pull the geometry out. Sculptress mode works with most of the brushes. It does not work with the move brush. So if I switch to the move brush, Sculptress just temporarily turns off. What we do now is we're using the Snake Hook brush kind of as a substitute move brush because it works really well with Sculptress mode. It's really great for blocking stuff out like this, especially when you're kind of improvising and you're playing around. Like I don't have a sketch or anything I'm working off. I'm just kind of playing with some ideas as I build this. So I'm filling this in with a clay brush, and as you'll see, I'm going to add some coral on the top of it. Sculptress mode is named after this technology that was created that Pixelogic acquired a couple years ago, a software called Sculptress, which they've now incorporated into ZBrush and ZBrushCore. So it really adds a lot of flexibility to the creative process. So I use a lot these days. And now I'm just kind of shaping the surface to cradle the octopus better. Okay, so now I'm going to block in some coral. And to do this, I'm going to use the clay buildup brush with this circular alpha. So I'm just putting in little coral-like objects that are sticking out, which I'll detail in a moment. Right now I'm just kind of figuring out where I want to put them. So I'm using Sculptress mode, which means that geometry is being added dynamically with each brush stroke. And this is a good example of an alternative workflow to how I did the octopus. So when I did the octopus, of course, I stressed using subdivisions and polygroups and all that kind of stuff. And the advantage, of course, of that is that I have all these tentacles that I need to pose. It's nice to be able to go up and down in subdivision levels when I need to move a piece of geometry and I don't want to obliterate the detail I've created. This part that I'm adding the coral to, of course, is static at this point. I'm not going to be changing it significantly beyond its current shape. So in this case, it's not a bad idea to use Sculptress mode, especially because I'm kind of sketching. So right, and what I'm doing now is I want to make some kind of like coral-like design. So I'm kind of fooling around with some ideas using the snake hook brush to kind of pull out something that suggests like sort of the otherworldly shape of corals. I'm not trying to make these realistic corals, so you know, you don't need to look up the species name for the type of brain coral I'm trying to emulate or whatever. But you know, I just want a variety of designs, something to sort of accentuate the story of our little octopus friend who is clearly chilling out near a coral reef. And again, this is another reason why I like Sculptress mode, because I can go in here and just put the detail right where I need it. So now I'm using clay buildup again to kind of draw out this sort of brain coral, and then to make, you know, these varieties of different types of details, little nubs and stuff to sort of suggest the tentacles of coral polyps, and then more brain coral, of course. So at this point, what I'm doing is I'm taking the H polish brush and I'm starting to flatten some of these details. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to create reflective surfaces so that these details make some kind of visual sense from a distance, because this will be fairly small. So by flattening it, I'm increasing the amount of the surface that receives a reflection or reflects the specular highlight. So you can sort of think of it as like drawing with the specular highlights. So the round surfaces, or these puffy surfaces that I'm flattening, have a very small highlight, and there's a lot of them. By flattening them, I'm broadening out that highlight and making it a little bit easier to kind of see the shape. If you compare the ones that I've flattened versus the ones that are still round, you can kind of see what I mean. So I'm flattening just all this stuff right here. And you can use H polish or trim dynamic. I kind of switch between the two fairly frequently. The difference is somewhat subtle. But I like H polish because as it flattens, the edges can get very nice and crisp. So you don't have to go back and use a pinch brush or anything like that. You get a nice crisp edge. It's great for cleaning surfaces and flattening edges and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to continue to do this, create more coral, more details around the entire bed around the octopus, and also check it out periodically in the gold material. Okay, so I spent some time and I added more of the coral reef around the octopus, and using pretty much kind of the same shape language throughout. I could tweak this kind of stuff for days. I'll probably go back and do even more on it, but I think I'm happy with it for now. There's a couple of things I wanted to point out while you're using Sculptress mode. So while this is on and you're adding these shapes here using the sculpting brushes, your point count is going to go up, as I mentioned before. At a certain point, it'll reach a limit and Sculptress mode will automatically turn off, and you'll get a little message here saying that Sculptress has reached this limit, so you can't use it anymore. There's a couple ways you can deal with this. You can change the limit. If you go into Preferences and expand the Mem menu here, I don't know why they didn't just write out memory, but it says Mem. But whatever, there is a slider here, so you can increase the max Sculptress polygons. So this is in millions, so that's 1.5 million is the limit, and I could continue to move this up, and the maximum limit is 2 million polygons. That's okay, you can change that. The problem with it is as you approach that limit, ZBrushCore tends to slow down as the model accumulates polygons. If I turn on the poly wireframe, you can kind of see how the surface, how the polygons are much smaller here on these parts of the model that I added. So you can see that these are a lot smaller than the surrounding polygons, and that's all because of Sculptress. So rather than setting a limit on it, what you can do is every once in a while decimate the model, and that will lower the polygon count so that you can continue using Sculptress. And it actually works well enough so that you it's hard to tell the difference. So for example, right now this is 561,475 points. So if I go into Z plugin and I'm going to expand Decimation Master, and I'm going to pick 250 for 250,000 points and just click on it, and it will analyze the mesh and it will calculate. So you can see the little orange slider go up. And this process we're going to be using a lot as we finish the ring. So this is sort of the basics to it. So it takes a few moments to calculate. And then once it's done, you can see it's gone down to 250,000 polygons, but really don't see much of a change here in the level of detail. If I turn on the polyframe, you can see that these little details down here are not quite as dense as they once were. So removed a lot of unnecessary polygons from that, polygons that were created in sculptress mode. That's a better strategy for dealing with that sculptress mode poly limit. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge these together, kind of like I did before. I'm going to make sure that I just have just the subtools that I want to merge visible. So this, let's turn on the solo button. So here's the ring, here is my octopus, and here is the webbing between the tentacles. So with all of these visible, I want to make sure they're all in their highest subdivision level. If they are subdivided, this one is not, because that's the one we decimated. So octopus, make sure it's all the way at subdivision level 6, and same with the webbing here, subdivision level 6. And so I'm just going to choose merge visible. Merge visible. And it's going to create a merged version right here. And this is 6.4 million polygons. So that's our merged version. If I turn on the polyframe, you can see that there's still separate polygroups for each mesh. But there's no longer any levels of subdivision. And so now what I'm going to do is dynamesh this and then decimate the dynameshed version. Dynamesh, there is a risk that we could lose some of the detail. We can bring it back a little bit though, so it's not the end of the world. So in order to keep as much of the detail as possible, I'm just going to use Dynamesh at the highest possible setting. So I'm going to expand in the tool palette. So I'm in tool, go down here to geometry, and then down here to Dynamesh. I'm going to set the resolution all the way up to the highest. So it's 1024 and hit Dynamesh. It's going to take a few moments to calculate. Okay, so after Dynamesh process is finished, we're left with 2.4 million polygons, so that's not bad. And looks like most of the detail survived. So we've reduced the polygon count, kept most of the details. So that's pretty good. One thing I want to deal with though is some of the space here behind the fins. I want to put some geometry in there so it's easier to print, more economical. There's a few other spots in here that could probably use a little extra geometry, maybe down here. So I'm going to go into the brush palette and choose the IMM primitives brush, and let's select polysphere and make sure sculptress mode is not on. So then I'll zoom in here and just add this polysphere, and it masks the rest of the surface. So I can switch over to move and just kind of push this in here. And I like using the low polygon surface since it just responds quickly to the sculpting brushes, especially the smooth brush, because this part is a little bit tedious. So more responsive brushes make it a little bit faster. And then don't forget, we can also press W for the gizmo. I'm going to click on this button so it goes to the center of that unmasked portion, being that polysphere. And then I'm going to hold the control key and then just move this over here. That'll duplicate that unmasked surface. So now we have another little blob of clay that I can go in here and manipulate. So Q for draw mode, and then I'm going to use the move brush. Just push this in here. All right, so I've gone in with the insert mesh brush and added geometry in these spaces that I think could use it. So some spaces down here in this area. So I'm going to hold control, drag, and release to clear the mask. Let's turn on polyframe. I'll turn off line for, actually, this makes it more obvious. So you can see the brightly colored low polygon surfaces are the geometry I added. So let's turn this off. And since I have Dynamesh mode is still active, I'm going to hold control, drag, and release to re-Dynamesh the surface. So it's going to blend all those parts together. So now if I turn on polyframe, you can see it's just one big surface. So now what I could do is go in here with my sculpting brushes and just do a little bit of cleanup to kind of, reduce the mesh look here and maybe bring back some of the detail. In the full version of ZBrush, there are tools for projection, which makes preserving detail even easier because you can literally either project from one surface onto another, or in other words, shrink wrap one subtool to another subtool, and that's a great way for bringing back detail. But you can also project your undo history, meaning from an earlier point or a later point in time, you can project onto the current surface, which makes it extremely flexible and easy to fix detail. In ZBrushCore, you kind of just got to work around that a little bit because it does not have those features. But that alone, if this is a workflow that you really get into and you enjoy working in ZBrush, once you feel comfortable, I strongly recommend upgrading the full version of ZBrush. No, Pixelogic is not paying me to say that. I'm just saying that those projection tools are some of the most useful tools within ZBrush. Okay, I think there's one last part that I want to put some geometry in. So I'll just go in here, select Insert Mesh Primitives, select my polysphere, drag on this, I'll switch over to Move, and Control Drag once to release the mask, and then Control Drag and release again to Dynamesh. And then go in here and just do a little bit of cleanup. Alright, so after we've done all of this, the last thing we need to do is decimate the model. So again, what I'm going to do, just because this is the way I like to work, I'm going to switch back to that original tool. This is the one with the separate subtools. And I'm going to append that merged version. That's this one right here. So we'll just call this one remeshed or dynameshed version or whatever, just to distinguish it. And it's a good time to save, so let's save this. I'm going to save it as Dumbo Octopus 14. I like to have lots of backup versions in addition to the quick save versions. I feel like you can't have too much of a backup. So I'll save that. And you can see here is our polyframe for the Dynameshed version, and we're at 2.3 million polygons. So what we want to do now is use Decimation Master to decimate it so we get down to a lower point count without losing any detail, and then we can export it for printing. So I'm going to choose Z plugin, and here's Decimation Master. In ZBrushCore, you're limited to these point counts. In the full version of ZBrush, there's many more options for Decimation Master, so it's a bit more powerful. But this will work for our purposes. So I'm going to click on 250K, and it's going to tessellate the surface, get it down to 250,000 polygons while keeping as much of the detail as possible. So here's the result. It's down to 250,000 points. Doesn't look like we lost too much detail. That's what the tessellation looks like on it. You can go in here and clean up some of this geometry. So for example, if we feel like we've lost too much detail on some of this brain coral, well, as long as we keep the model under 1 million points, it's going to be printable. So we could go back in here, turn on Sculptress mode. So I'm going to switch over to, say, the clay brush, turn on Sculptress mode, and then I can go in here and just start to kind of tighten up that detail just in the places where I need it. So you can see the point count's going to go up, but I have a fair amount of leeway before I get up to 1 million points. And I would only do this on the parts that are really visible, that are really going to make a difference. But you can tighten up the detail that way. Once you're satisfied with the model, of course, we can then go into Z plugins and expand 3D Print Hub. So first thing we want to do is update size ratios so it exports to the right size. So click on that, and we want to make it 18 by 26 by 19 millimeters. You can check the mesh volume. So if it says that it's not a solid, it can't compute the volume, then what we need to do is go in and see where we might have holes or other geometry that's causing a problem and plug those holes up. So I went back a few steps to the Dynameshed version and went around and see if I could plug in a few more holes, and then I was able to get a closed volume. So if you go to Z plugin and hit check mesh volume again, you get this readout that says the mesh volume is 1,496 cubic millimeters, so I know it's a closed surface, and I can go ahead and export it to my printing software. So go to Z plugin one more time, update size ratios, never hurts. So do that, and then I'll go in here and choose export to STL, OBJ, VRML, whatever my favorite format is. Mine is STL. So I'll export that, and then I can send it to my printing software. So I hope you enjoyed this short series to give you an idea of the power of ZBrushCore. You can, in fact, make some pretty cool jewelry in it. It's a great way to enter the world of digital sculpting jewelry with ZBrush. So check out ZBrushCore if you haven't already. It's pretty powerful stuff.